All right. Last Wednesday night, we finished up the church at Ephesus, Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through about verse 6. And it's important to remember the context of the backdrop of the book of Revelation. A lot of people want to talk about Revelation and the end of the world. Keep in mind that it's expressly stated within the book of Revelation that these things must shortly take place. All right, and the reason why Jesus prefaces the entire Revelation with this message to the seven churches of Asia, the whole reason for that is because they are going to be directly affected by the crumbling away of the empire of Rome. And as the empire falls, civilization falls, ushers in what we call the Dark Ages. And that's part of the reason why these churches, it's going to be increasing as the Roman Empire becomes more and more vulnerable, more and more at its core, kind of starting to crumble away. There's going to be more and more persecution against the saints. And Revelation is all about how basically God is going to bring judgment upon those who trouble his people, but you saints need to make sure to stay faithful, because there is a home in heaven waiting for you. And that's what all of Revelation is about. Now, certainly there is application throughout Revelation for us looking forward to the end of time when the Lord returns to redeem the saved, bring everybody to judgment, and then to a home in heaven for the faithful. But that's the specific backdrop of the book of Revelation. Now, these seven churches of Asia, as we've already talked about, they're on a circuit going from the island of Patmos, the island of Patmos being right here. This is where John, the Apostle John, the last remaining apostle, as far as we know, is alive. He's the last one. This is being written in the 95-ish, around that range, AD. And John is here on Patmos in exile. And so he's receiving this revelation from the Lord here on Patmos. And so then the whole book of Revelation is being taken to Ephesus, and then to Smyrna, and then on through our circuit. So the very next one that we see is the church at Smyrna. Now, it's interesting to note that Smyrna is not very far, at least by our standards, away from Ephesus. And really, not any of these churches are really all that far away from one another by our standards. Smyrna is about 35 miles north of Ephesus. Both of these cities are extremely heavily trade cities, big commercial cities, because they're in ports. Ephesus is at a port. Smyrna is at a port. Pergamum. They're a little bit closer, or a little bit further inland, so it's not as much of a trade city. But Ephesus and Smyrna are the two big ones in terms of trade and commercial economics and that sort of thing for the Roman Empire. So as we go forward in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, the church at Smyrna was built, so some of these pictures, so this is the agora, or remains of the agora in Smyrna. There's a great big marketplace that existed, and then some of these other pictures also depict some neat ruins and stuff there in Smyrna. This is a kind of a recreation of what Smyrna would have looked like in its heyday. So you see the big harbor here. This is actually an artificial harbor. And Smyrna was known for being unique in that it could actually enclose its harbor either during bad weather or time of war. And so they were able to kind of keep their harbor clear and try to, almost like what do they call that, breakwater? In times of high waves and things like that. So Smyrna was actually pretty famous for that. It's also one of the few planned cities from its very inception, conception. From the very beginning, it was planned and laid out in a grid style, which is really something you don't really see in the ancient world very often. And really, even in America, many of our towns are notable, especially older towns and cities are notable if they were planned early on. Some cities are laid out in a grid-like structure. And Smyrna was one of those. It was actually known as the jewel of Asia because of how beautiful the city was. And again, this is just kind of a depiction. It's not an actual photograph. But it was built around 300 BC, this city was. And it was well known among the Roman Empire. Like I said, it was a great trade city. Major wine trade took place through Smyrna. And as I mentioned, it's a beautiful city. It was known as the Jewel of Asia, also the Glory of Asia. I mentioned it was a planned city, and it had a world-famous stadium, a world-famous library, and it was also notable for a monument to Homer. Whether or not Homer actually was from Smyrna, Smyrna at least claimed Homer was born in Smyrna. And so they had a great monument to Homer because he was also world famous. So those are three kind of claims to fame that Smyrna had kind of going for it. Just like Ephesus, we talked about Ephesus being a free city. Many of the cities of the Roman Empire were conquered cities. And so these cities were governors and individuals were put in place that were from the Roman Empire. But Ephesus, as we talked about, was not, and Smyrna was not. It still retained its identity as a city-state. It had its own government. Never were Roman soldiers ever placed within Ephesus or Smyrna because they were independent. And Rome recognized the value of Smyrna and recognized what they were about in terms of their trade and the value that it brought to the Roman Empire. It was a city of worship, but more specifically, it was a city of pagan worship. They had temples to a whole bunch of the Roman or Greek gods. There was temples to Cybele, to Apollo, to Asclepius, to Aphrodite, who the Romans referred to as Venus, to Zeus, who the Romans called Jupiter. There were many temples to many different gods, and they almost had kind of a, you know how some cities have a medical district and then a residential district and then maybe a commercial district. They had a worship district. Okay, all of these temples were all kind of in a square. And so if anybody wanted to go worship, they would go to one part of the city because that's where the temples were. And so all of these temples to these Greek gods existed within this city. Now this is a statue of Dea Roma or Dea Romana. Okay, this is she's referred to as the goddess of Rome, but what she's meant to represent is the spirit of the Roman Empire. She wasn't an actual figure in Roman mythology, but she was basically represented the character of Rome and the spirit of Rome. And there was a temple to Dea Roma within Smyrna as well. In fact, Smyrna was a major center of what's called the imperial cult. Smyrna was a center not only of worship of the Roman Empire, which is embodied by Dea Roma, but also of Caesar worship. And that's why it's called the imperial cult. Once a year, all citizens of Rome, and this isn't exclusive to Smyrna, but all citizens of Rome are required to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar while they said Caesar is Lord. And then they would be given a certificate stating that they had performed their worship to Caesar for the year, and then they were good for a year, at which time they had to renew their certificate or receive a new certificate, kind of like how we, almost how we renew our stickers on our cars, sort of thing. And it wasn't really so much a issue of worship. It was really more about loyalty. That's really why the Roman Empire demanded it. It really wasn't about, we really want you to worship Caesar in the sense that pay proper homage as to a god. They didn't really care about that. They wanted to ensure loyalty. Because as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, you could worship all the other gods of the Greek pantheon or Roman pantheon. They really didn't care too much. Certainly as long as Christianity kind of entered into a situation where if you're saying there's only one God, that puts you at contradiction with Rome and the Greeks. But this was kind of the backdrop of the society, especially here in Smyrna, because this was a big deal. Some cities in Rome were not particularly, they weren't maybe as motivated or zealous to check your certificate or to ensure your certificate is renewed every year, that you've offered your incense and said Caesar is Lord. But some cities were far more specific about it. Smyrna was, of all the cities of Rome, or of Asia, Smyrna was the one that took care to make sure every citizen renewed their certificate every year. That's why I said that they were center of the imperial cult. They also had a large Jewish population. They would often basically tell on any Christians, or for that matter, anyone who didn't offer the incense to Caesar. But more specifically, they had attention to Christians, because obviously Christians to them were a blasphemous sect that had come out of them, the Jews, and they were blaspheming against Moses and the old law as far as they were concerned. So they had special care to check or to attempt to get Christians in trouble if they weren't offering their incense. And so that's part of what's kind of the backdrop of what's taking place at Smyrna and why Jesus says the things he says in the book of Revelation, or to Smyrna specifically. All right, any thoughts so far through this? All right. According to, there's a couple of writings. Polycarp was supposedly an elder at the church in Smyrna in the late or the early 100s AD. He's referred to as the bishop of the church at Smyrna. I tend to think that Polycarp was a Christian, that he was a faithful Christian, but that he was one of the elders in Smyrna, as that's the teaching of the New Testament, to have multiple bishops or multiple elders. But according to some accounts that were written regarding Polycarp and his death, in fact, the martyrdom of Polycarp is one of these writings. He was given a choice of worshiping Caesar or death by burning. And the Jews were the ones who were leading the charge because he had refused to offer up the incense. It was basically every year when it came time, especially to check certificates, the Christians did what they could to try to avoid any attention. But they did not offer the incense to Caesar. They would not say the word Caesar is Lord. And every year, some Christians were caught. Now, the penalties varied depending on their status in society and so forth. But given the fact that the majority of the Christians, and Jesus even references their complete destitution in his letter to Smyrna, many of these Christians, if they were caught and their certificate, they had not received a certificate for having offered their incense to Caesar, they were either jailed or put to death. Well, in this case, Polycarp, the Jews were really kind of looking at the leaders of the church in Smyrna, which would have been the elders. Polycarp was one of those. They riled up the crowd against Polycarp, and famously they tried to burn him to death, and somehow the fire wouldn't catch. And so they actually ended up killing him by sword, I believe is what it was. They attempted to burn him and the fire just wouldn't catch. And so they had to kill him a different way. So Smyrna was a very proud city, and this speaks more to the attitude of the population of the city of Smyrna. They consider themselves the first in beauty of the cities of Asia, or what we refer to as Asia Minor. The first in Caesar worship, which they were. Categorically, quantifiably, they were. And then they considered themselves the birthplace of Homer. And so they were arrogant. They looked down on the poor, on the humble, on those who were meek. They did not have any patience for those who were poor and those who didn't share their values, especially as it pertained to their city, their worship, whether it was the Greek gods, but most especially Caesar, and certainly anything having to do with Homer and the literature that he wrote. Gilbert?
But also they were willing to be tortured instead of, how easy would it be? One time a year, really, say that little pension,
yep.
And I'm out here, and they were not willing to do that. So we put ourselves there. Obviously, they are so intrigued by this story of a Savior that was buried and then resurrected, but somehow they are more than that. They believe it so much that they're willing to take that torture. It makes me think of Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 15, hey, if you don't believe me, there's more than 500 people over there that you can go ask for verification. And again, putting myself there, I would have been one of those people. I would have had to go and ask. So I'm making the case for me that
right.
not only
Right.
Because if you're going to torture me, I'm going to know
Yeah.
that I'm not dying for something that I'm unsure of.
Right. And that is just a story, or that's something somebody made up. And you're absolutely right. The conviction of the brethren in Smyrna, this is why one of the commentaries mentioned about Smyrna that becoming and remaining a Christian in Smyrna was to take your life in your hands. The church here was a place of courage and conviction. In fact, the commentary mentioned it was a place of heroes because they were willing to die and they were so convicted that I mean, how many of us would at least maybe attempt to justify, well, it's just a pinch of incense. It's just 3 words, Caesar is Lord. Even though I don't believe it, I can still at least, pay the price of loyalty to Caesar. And yet, because it wasn't just Caesar is king, it was Caesar is Lord. There was a deification aspect to it. And they refused to even say the words. They refused to offer that, and that's what incense was. It was about worship. It was about homage. And they refused to do that. And in fact, I can find no evidence, no reference, and at some point there may have been some, but I can find no reference to any Christians who did actually perform that worship to Caesar. All I read about is Christians who didn't, who refused to.
And whether it was 2 members, 200 members, 2,000, but the number doesn't matter. That
Right.
principle is astounding.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like you said, so far removed from Jerusalem, from the events of Jesus being crucified and resurrected, and yet they had the strength of conviction, the determination to remain faithful, that they refused and were willing to die. They refused to yield their faith. And I think that certainly has a great amount of application, no matter what age in which we live, regardless of if we lived in an age where Caesar was deified, or we live in an age today where there's a whole lot of other things in our society that are deified for all intents and purposes. People may not call them gods, but for all intents and purposes, they are idols of the heart. And the same application exists for us. It tests our conviction and our determination to remain faithful to the Lord. And I think that of the churches, it's interesting that of the churches, Smyrna is one of only 2 where nothing bad is said about them. And we'll talk about that when we actually go through the text. But Smyrna and Philadelphia, nothing bad, nothing they needed to correct, nothing they needed to fix, only good and only commendation from the Lord is written to Smyrna and Philadelphia. And certainly, I mean, it kind of gives you an idea of just how harsh the conditions were for these brethren, and yet just how rich, as Jesus calls them, they were in the Spirit. And I don't just think that means that's a reference to their home in heaven. I think it's also a reference to their character. You may be poor, you may be destitute, but you are rich. Not only do they have a home in heaven waiting, a reward waiting for them, but it speaks to the strength of their character, the strength of their conviction. Any other thoughts through that?
Just choosing to stay there.
Oh, yeah.
That's a decision
How
that boggles my mind because they're not that far from some of those other
Absolutely.
where they could go, but they chose to risk their necks and stay, maybe be an influence in the city of worship.
Right.
Pretty incredible.
And what's interesting about that too, and whether it was because they had family there that maybe they were trying to convince, maybe they had livelihoods, travel in the ancient times was not nearly as easy as it is for us. Okay, and if you had to have money to do anything. I mean, you had to have money to have people help you on the highway. So oftentimes you had to hire not mercenaries, but guards to kind of help you if you're traveling with your family. A lot of times people had to hire a bodyguard, that type of thing, just to travel with them from place to place. So it was not a simple thing to get in your car and pack up your stuff and go from Smyrna to Ephesus. And yet, as terrible as it was, you'd think some of them would have, and some of them may have, but there was a church there. We don't know how many, but there was a church there. And presumably, it was helped established by Paul. Paul went all through this region. All of these cities that are being mentioned, Paul went through all of these places. And so certainly, Paul helped establish a church here in Smyrna as well.
Do you think these were Jews in this congregation?
It's hard to say. I don't think so. part of it may,
Jewish history was Daniel.
right,
History.
sure. The refusal to submit to a false god, and that could very well have been some of them. Some of the references by Jesus, though, it's almost as if they're set apart from the Jews. Now, certainly as Christians, once you became a Christian, it didn't matter anyway, Jew or Gentile. But it is possible. Many of these cities had a core group of Jewish Christians that then expanded to include Gentile Christians as well. Where did Paul go? The first place he went in every city, if it had one, to the synagogue. Okay, that's where Paul would go in every city first, because of all the people who should hear the gospel and be willing to receive it should be the Jews. Oftentimes it was absolutely the opposite case, but he went there first, except for what city that didn't have a synagogue? Where Lydia, the seller of purple, was. Philippi. Yeah, Philippi didn't have one. And so here's a group of brethren, and it could very well be that a core group there were Jews, but I don't think by any means that these were only Jewish brethren. Some of what Jesus says, I think there's quite a bit I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there's more than just Jewish brethren here, that there's Gentile brethren as well.
I could see this happening, that they would tell the Gentile Christians about the God they worship.
Oh, and about Daniel. Yeah.
History of what God has done throughout time to kind of bring them up to speed.
Absolutely.
The God they're obeying, worshiping now, in Christ too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
did the very same thing. I could see that happening.
And I could certainly see the strength of the Jewish brethren's conviction in serving the one Jehovah, the one true God. I could see that being an encouragement to the Gentile brethren as well. If any one of them started to maybe capitulate to the demands of the Caesar incense and so forth, that might have given permission, I guess you could say, by example, for everybody else to do it. But the fact that there may have been a core group that absolutely would not yield, that may have provided even more strength to these Gentile brethren as well. Not to say they were weak in any way, but whenever you see a brother or sister standing up for the truth and doing what's right, that always encourages you as well. It kind of rehardens your resolve to make sure that you're doing what's right as well. Yeah. Anything else through that? I have a quote from William Barclay's commentary on the church at Smyrna here. I think is actually an interesting quote. He says, "In a city where the splendor of heathen worship might well have suffocated the life out of the Christian church, in a city where the pride of men looked on the humble Christians with arrogant contempt, in a city where every Christian was between the devil of the demands of Caesar worship and the deep sea of Jewish slander and malignancy, there were Christians who were faithful unto death." I just thought that was a very poignant, very kind of a great summation of the society that these Christians were in and what they were facing, and despite it all, the fact that they were willing to be faithful unto death. I think it shows greatly that character of kind of what they're facing. Any thoughts through that? All right. So going to Revelation, that's not going to be the right thing. All right, there we go. Revelation chapter 2, and we're starting at verse 8. Revelation 2, starting at verse 8. Remember, we just finished our discussion with Ephesus in verse 7, and so we get here to verse 8. "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life." Now remember, with every single one of the 7 churches, Jesus always starts off with the angel of the church in Smyrna. And as we talked about before, this is kind of representing the church as a singular entity. Okay, the church is all made up of individual members, but this is kind of representing that singular candlestick, so to speak, as Jesus referenced with the Ephesians. But notice with the introductions, he did with Ephesus. For instance, in verse 1, "These things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands." This goes back to Revelation chapter 1 and how Jesus is being kind of presented to John at the beginning of this revelation. And that's why we call it revelation, because it's all one revelation. Right? We don't say revelations because, and it's not titled Revelations, because it's not multiple revelations. It's all one. And so here in verse 8, we have the exact same thing. These things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. This comes from chapter 1, verse 17. And as remember, verse 16, we see the 7 stars. Earlier, we saw him walking in the midst of the golden lampstands in verse 12. Well, here in verse 17, John says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am he who lives and was dead. And behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. And I have the keys of Hades and of death. Jesus, for his own reasons, and some of them we can kind of glean from the context of what he's saying to these churches, he takes from what takes place back here in chapter 1 and reintroduces it into these churches to Asia. For instance, with Ephesus, it's that reference to, I know my churches. They are mine. They belong to me, and I know what's happening in each one of them. And he makes that case to Ephesus specifically because he wants Ephesus to know, I know your character and the fact that you've left your first love. And that's one of the things he had to address with Ephesus. It all starts out with that introduction. I know my churches. I know those that are mine. And so here with the church at Smyrna, it's really interesting that he brings out specifically, what would you, if you were to characterize the statement of Jesus being the first and the last, the fact that he was dead and he came to life, how would you characterize that for the church at Smyrna? Let's break it up. The first and the last. The Alpha and the Omega is the concept here, which we see later on in Revelation as well. What does that represent? What does that mean? He's the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.
He has no beginning, he has no end.
He has no beginning, he has no end, and as a result, he is the one to whom we must give our complete commitment, our complete dedication and devotion, right? He is the be-all and end-all. And of course, the brethren in the church of Smyrna, do they have that conviction? Absolutely. They're willing to go to death because of their conviction that Jesus is the first and the last. He is the be-all and end-all. He is the only one whom we're to serve. Okay, so the fact that Jesus references the first and the last, there is no other. There is no other worthy to be worshipped, and Smyrna knows that. Or the brethren of Smyrna knows that. And the fact that he was dead and came to life. The fact that he was raised from the dead. What specific meaning do you think that has for Smyrna? And Smyrna is not going to be the only one, but especially given the context of what we're talking about. Yeah, persecution. Even if men put you to death, does that have any power over their soul? No. Jesus was raised from the dead, and what hope do the brethren in Smyrna have because Jesus was killed and was raised from the dead? That the same thing will happen to them. The promise of God is that all those who are faithful even unto death, that he will raise those on the last day. And so I think it's really interesting that both of these phrases from Jesus, which are separate in Revelation 1, he puts together here in chapter 2, verse 8 to Smyrna to show that you know that I am the one you serve, that your complete devotion and dedication is to me, even to the point of death. And you have that hope, that promise from God that you will be raised one day because of your dedication and your devotion. And that's in direct contrast to this devotion, even if it's false devotion to Caesar, devotion to the false gods of the Greeks and the Romans that were there, the temples that were there in Smyrna. That's in contrast to all that. They don't hold a candle to Jesus. Yeah, Gilbert.
There's a connection also in that first phrase, first and the last, to the historical slide that we looked at first, where you mentioned one of the nicknames is the glory of Asia, the jewel of Asia. Well, I've got something that your jewel of Asia doesn't have.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. You're right. All of the claims to fame that Smyrna had and how much they exalted themselves, and yet they didn't have the Lord. And if they didn't have the Lord, obviously, then none of the other stuff mattered at all. And so that's a great point, Gilbert. They were the first in Caesar worship. They were the first in beauty, and yet Jesus says, "I'm the first and the last. Nothing compares to me."
Kind of tie in with that, talk about a pre-planned city. I would presume in that section over there, section for all the temples, kind of pre-planned. We know we want this God, this one, this and her, but no room again for the Lord.
For the Lord, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. You're right.
Unless they had an unknown God.
Yeah, like Athens had it to the unknown God. Yeah, as far as I haven't read anything about them having one of those, but yeah, certainly they, of course, Athens, they were very, in fact, Luke even tells us they were very superstitious. They were very, at least spiritually minded in the sense of thinking about their gods. And so they did that just in case we missed one. We want to accidentally upset any gods we've missed. So, yeah, you're right.
You also think in a greater context of history, even back in their time, they were aware of kingdoms that have risen and fallen prior to the Romans. Now
Yep.
the Romans are in charge, but he said they're being allowed to have their own government. So there's rulers that come and go, things that come and go, but here's
Yeah.
the one
Who has always been and always will
be
be.
there after these are gone.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And even beyond just individual rulers, Rome itself, Caesars came and go. Of course, certain Caesars were deified, particularly Tiberius. He was kind of the beginning of the imperial sect. But some of the Caesars were deified, some weren't. But Caesar, as an office, was kind of the main deification. Whoever held that office, kind of like the Pope. Whoever holds the office of the Pope, people exalt and uphold, whoever's in that particular office, even though we don't find that in the New Testament. But yeah, you're absolutely right. First and the last, the one who's always been, always will be, who cannot be conquered, who cannot be destroyed, who cannot be superseded. And the brethren of Smyrna know that. Yeah, so verse 9. He goes on to say, "I know your works." Again, with every one of these 7 churches, he makes that statement, "I know your works." Whether it's good or bad, I know what's going on in my churches. He kind of mentioned that with I walk in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. And we're told those golden lampstands are the churches. So Jesus knows full well everything that's taking place. He knows, and what's beautiful about this in verse 9, with Ephesus, this held a slightly different connotation, I guess you could say. Because Jesus says, "I know your works, I know all the things you're doing, and what you're doing is good in the things that you're doing right. But I also know that you've left your first love. Go back and do the first works." Okay, so many of the works that they were doing were fine, they were good, they were right, but then they were also leaving something undone, either in action or in heart. Well, here in verse 9, "I know your works," but in this context, there is no "I know both the good and the bad." He says, "I know the good. I see all of the good." That there is nothing, at least nothing that Jesus specifies here, that is bad or needs to be corrected. He says, "I know your works," and then he specifies. He says, "I know your tribulation, your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." This term tribulation, it's defined as great pressure, grievous trouble, or severe trial and suffering. That's what this term tribulation. The New King James and the King James and all the English translations, sometimes there will be different terms translated tribulation that may bring out a certain aspect. This refers directly to pressure. Okay, and it's not just the physical pressure they're facing of persecution. I think this also carries with it the sense of emotional or mental, even spiritual pressure. The pressure to conform to their society. The pressure to give in to even the false lip service to Caesar. The pressure that they're facing by their society to be like them. And Jesus says, "I know what you're going through. I see it. I recognize it." It wasn't just the physical pain or the physical suffering they were going through, but again, the mental or emotional, the spiritual pressure they were going through. Then he says poverty. This is, and I mentioned before that this is not just living paycheck to paycheck type of thing. This is complete destitution. And some commentaries suggest that the reason why they were destitute may have been a result of their being Christians. One of the commentaries mentioned Hebrews 10:32-34. The Hebrew writer refers to the plundering of their goods. Now, I had always taken that to mean that they were willing to give generously to brethren and those who were teaching the gospel, because the context seemed to suggest that. But it's also possible that the Hebrew writer is referring to the fact that people, because they were Christians, their goods were plundered, literally plundered. They were taken by others against the brethren, against their will. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but that was kind of a reference that was suggested as this, part of the reason why they were so destitute was because maybe, first of all, their goods were plundered, they were taken from them, but also the fact that because they're Christians, because they believe in only one God, what kind of effect might that have on their job prospects? I mean, who wants to hire somebody who doesn't believe the way they do in terms of glorifying Caesar, of glorifying Dea Romana, Pax Romana, or deifying, or not Pax Romana, Dea Romana. Pax Romana was a period of time. Or deifying the city of Smyrna.
Bring negative attention to your business.
Yeah, you're employing one of those people, and so just the aspect of being able to have a job, to be able to even support yourself, would have been a very difficult thing to be involved in that economy in Smyrna. And again, with all the trade that they did, with all of the, example that Smyrna sought to set, that the world would know all about Smyrna and how much they deify Caesar and glorify the gods of the Greeks, they certainly wouldn't want anyone giving off an example like the Christians did. That might taint the example of Smyrna to the rest of Rome. And so the fact that these brethren were destitute, you can imagine the ways in which, or imagine why they were destitute the way that they were. And yet, Jesus says, but you are rich. Now this term rich, it's abundantly wealthy. And the fact that you have such a contrast between the terms that Jesus uses. You have nothing in the flesh. Literally, they have nothing in the flesh. Yet in the spirit, they have everything. And again, I certainly think that speaks to the home in heaven that waits for them as they remain faithful. But also, I think it speaks to the richness of their character, that they are facing such trying times and are remaining faithful. That richness of the spiritual blessings that they have because they've submitted to the first and the last. The fact that they put rest their hope on the resurrection unto a home in heaven. That's why Jesus says, but you are abundantly wealthy, even though nobody else realizes it, nobody else sees it. Jesus does. And of course, who's the only one that matters? Jesus is. Nola?
I think you're kind of bringing this out. The whole message is this series about first
Yeah.
class, dead alive, poverty rich.
Yep.
They say they're Jews, they're really of Satan. Verse 10, you may get thrown in prison, you can have your life.
Yes. The vast contrast, yeah, and when we finish this letter to Smyrna, we'll kind of see all of those parallels, which are really direct contrasts with one another, and it really stands out. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up here in verse 9 next Wednesday. Thank you, everybody.